The US Department of Justice classifies a Fox News reporter a co-conspirator as part of a leak investigation. Is the Obama administration no longer just fighting a war on whistleblowers, but on the freedom of the press as a whole? And thousands protest as Chile's Sebastián Piñera delivers his final State of the Nation address. What has he achieved in office? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Under President Obama, more government leakers have been prosecuted under the 1917 Espionage Act than under all prior administrations combined. But over the last week, it's become clear that it's not just leakers, but the journalists who cultivate them as sources who are being monitored by the government. On Monday, the Washington Post reported that James Rosen, a Fox News correspondent, had been named a co-conspirator to the leaking of classified materials, and that the Department of Justice had obtained a warrant to inspect his private emails. The case relates to the prosecution of a former State Department official who was indicted for allegedly telling Rosen that US intelligence believed North Korea would respond to additional UN sanctions with more nuclear tests. This all comes after it was revealed the DOJ had subpoenaed 2 months' worth of the Associated Press's phone records in relation to a separate leak probe. Civil liberties groups and journalists are incensed by what the American Civil Liberties Union has called an unacceptable abuse of power by the Obama administration. I'm joined from New York by James Goodale. He was general counsel for the New York Times during the Pentagon Papers controversy of the 1970s. And here in the studio is Julian Sanchez, a research fellow at the Cato Institute who works on privacy, the media and technology. James Goodale, first of all then, general counsel for the New York Times as the Nixon administration lashed out at the publication of the Pentagon Papers, the highly critical official secret history of the Vietnam War. So you appear to be pretty well placed to judge the Obama administration's respect of press freedom. And last week, after the news about AP came out, you said that Obama was approaching Nixon in his attitude towards the freedom of the press. Now that we have news of James Rosen, this Fox News correspondent, has your assessment changed at all?
Well, last week I had Obama in second place ahead of Bush II. And to use American lexicon, perhaps a half a game out of first, which means very close to Nixon, just based on AP and a whole lot of other things. But I have to say that the Rosen matter is extremely serious. And I would say now he's tied. And he will go ahead of Nixon if he continues to pursue Julian Assange. But he may be even edging ahead of Nixon now. That Rosen matter is extremely serious because what Obama is really saying is to a journalist is don't ask. There's no don't ask, don't tell. It's don't ask somebody who has access to national security documents, because if you ask, you're going to be accused of conspiring to violate the Espionage Act.
I mean, there was some discussion last week after the AP revelations as to whether, in the end, this is more about intimidating the whistleblower rather than the journalists involved. But do you think that debate has changed significantly now?
Well, the whistleblower is part of a larger picture because it's not just the information we want from whistleblowers. We want a general flow of information out of the government. Everything is classified in the government. So anytime you talk to anybody in the Defense Department, there's a real chance that what he is telling you is classified because he's got nothing else to say. So I think it's more than whistleblowing. We want a free flow of information out of the Defense Department, and we don't want to see people who are giving information to the public to be indicted. And as you pointed out in the setup, 6 indictments by Obama, 3 by all the presidents of the United States before Obama, of people who have leaked.
Yeah, but in your own experience as general counsel of the New York Times during the Nixon administration, I mean, didn't he go after individual journalists? Neil Sheehan, the journalist who actually, revealed the Pentagon Papers, comes to mind. I mean, is this anything new necessarily? Why is Obama any worse?
No, it's really new. The first person anybody went after was Ellsberg.
Daniel Ellsberg,
Daniel Ellsberg. He was the person who leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. Shortly thereafter, or maybe actually at the same time, he went after Sheehan. He indicted Ellsberg. That's your very first indictment. And he gave up trying to indict Sheehan. And that's why I say, just if we can go fast forward from those events to Obama. If Obama now goes after Assange, it's pretty much like Nixon when he went after Neil Sheehan, because they're both parts of the press. And the theory that Obama says he's going to use is this conspiracy theory to which I referred earlier, which only requires, in the real world, that Assange talked to Private Bradley Manning, who was the leaker. And so the amount of proof that's necessary for that kind of prosecution is very slim. And therefore, when you think now about Rosen, which is what we started off talking about, when the government went in to get a search warrant of Rosen's emails, there isn't much proof that's required when you go before the judge. It's a pernicious theory which has no objective other than to stop the press from asking those who have access to national security information. They're trying to shut the whole thing down.
Julian Sanchez, and we do have more, I think we're getting slightly more information then about exactly what was asked for by the DOJ as far as Rosen's emails are concerned. Is that comforting you at all as you try and keep a watch on press freedom and how much we're being monitored?
Not entirely. I mean, one of the more disturbing things here, as James noted, was that the warrant application here was premised on the idea that Rosen himself was effectively an abettor or co-conspirator of the leaker's underlying act. And that's sort of disturbing whether or not they ultimately indict Rosen, because traditionally there's been this sort of division that there are people who are in a position of trust, who have, agreed to accept certain restrictions as a condition of a security clearance, and they are subject reasonably to a higher level of control over what they can disclose because they've essentially agreed to it, and that people who receive classified information, even knowing that it's being disclosed to them improperly, are not held to that same standard unless they have some kind of demonstrable intent to harm the United States in some way. And so in a way to get around that distinction, which would enable them to get Rosen's email, to get a warrant for his email, since he too was now potentially a criminal, they effectively erase that distinction by making him a conspirator in the underlying leak.
But not only then did the judge agree to that determination that he was a co-conspirator, but the judge also suggested that there was no requirement to tell Rosen that his emails were being monitored.
Right. This is a broader part of a problem we have with third-party records, which used to be a relatively trivial category of information, but in the internet era encompasses essentially huge kind of digital dossiers about almost everything we do online. Everyone we speak to, every website we visit, every conversation we have is in some sense held by a third party, recorded and stored on some other server.
So you're talking about the era of cloud computing, I suppose, are you?
Right.
Yahoo
so
Mail,
your Gmail is stored
Mail,
on someone else's computer.
Right.
And the premise here is that, one, because someone else is holding this stuff, you have a diminished expectation of privacy, so the usual Fourth Amendment standards don't necessarily apply. It does seem in this case they at least got a search warrant for the email. But also that, because in theory these are the third party's records, the fiction here is, well, these are actually just Google's business records, not your private emails, and therefore the usual requirement to notify the target of a warrant doesn't apply. It's enough to tell Google. This isn't a special kind of dispensation they got to keep it secret in this case.
I mean, there was a case about the government using simple what we call national security letters, for example, to try and access this kind of data. And getting struck, and getting criticized for it. I mean, are there any safeguards on all this stuff? Or?
Relatively few. I mean, there are internal safeguards for grand jury subpoenas for telephone toll records, and that's why people think they're going to know whenever something like this happened. The head of the AP condemned the phone record seizure in their case as a massive and unprecedented intrusion. And yet, if you look at the FBI's internal guidelines, they're very explicit that these are just rules for grand jury subpoenas. They don't apply to search warrants, as in the case involving Rosen, national security letters, 215 orders under the Patriot Act, a whole array of other tools the government can use to get electronic data. We know about, under the Bush administration, at least one case where actually using no legal process at all.
Post-it notes.
Post-it notes. An FBI analyst obtained not 2 months, but 22 months of records on 7 phone lines belonging to Washington Post and New York Times reporters, and it was 3 years before anyone learned that that had been uploaded into the FBI's database.
But you raised a question, though, Julian, just how much spying on reporters, and actually, frankly, I mean, we should be asking about everyone else as well, maybe. You know, how much is actually going on, and is there any way for us to know, and is there any right for us to know?
It's very difficult. You know, every year there are a fairly detailed report is published by the U.S. courts about wiretaps. How many wiretaps are issued at every level, what kind of crimes they're investigating, whether people are convicted of crimes after the fact, how many people's conversations are intercepted, and for various kinds of orders to get electronic records, including both transactional data about who you're talking to and what you're reading, and also the contents of those electronic communications themselves, there really isn't any parallel reporting requirement that would give us a big picture sense. And in many cases, there isn't even a requirement that the actual target of that surveillance be notified at any point.
Just very quickly, Julian, before I bring James back in, I mean, when we were covering the AP story last week, it was still breaking, but we had various theories as to whether any guidelines have been broken, whether AP might even have a case to take the DOJ to court. Do we have any more information here? Are there First Amendment issues now? Do we know whether, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the internal guidelines were certainly skirted, but does AP have a case now in court?
I think it would be an uphill battle. It would be very hard under current doctrine to make a Fourth Amendment case. They could make perhaps a First Amendment chilling effect argument, but I think it would be an uphill battle, frankly.
James Goodale, since these stories started breaking, then since the AP case, certainly, we have the Obama administration pointing to its support of media shield laws. Does that put your mind at rest as you try and assess the Obama administration's concern about First Amendment rights and press freedom?
Not at all. If I can brag, I'm called the father of the reporter's privilege because I in part invented it. So I'm up to speed, not that that impresses anybody, but to be specific.
It does.
Oh, it does, okay. So to answer your question specifically, what happened in AP was that the subpoena guidelines had an exception in them for national security. So therefore, the Attorney General is saying, listen, I followed the guidelines because this involved national security. Big uproar, hullabaloo. Obama says, well, look, I'll calm the fires. You know, it's really can be solved with a reporter's privilege bill. Well, guess what? The reporter's privilege bill has, as an exception, it has a national security exception. So he's offering up nothing, and it's a ridiculous response to the AP
in fact,
problem.
The codification, perhaps, of this sort of procedure to
Well, yeah, that's a very good point. In other words, it'll be even worse. It'll be even worse than it was before Obama had the problem. And he, supported a different bill when he was a senator.
Right.
And then he came back as president and said, "Oh, I'm not in favor of that bill. I want a huge national security exception." And laden down with that exception, the bill died in some large part of what Obama did.
Well, let's see what the Obama administration says when these concerns have been put to them.
This is among, if not the most serious, it is within the top 2 or 3 most serious leaks that I've ever seen. It put the American people at risk, and that is not hyperbole. It put the American people at risk, and trying to determine who was responsible for that, I think, required very aggressive action.
I mean, there was some skepticism about Eric Holder's comments there. He's, of course, talking about the AP specifically and the investigation into the Undi Bomber 2.0, the Yemen collection, perhaps some Saudi sting operation, and so forth. Now we've got this new case then of Rosen and an assessment of North Korea's reaction in the case of UN sanctions. Do you think? I mean, are we going to, and we haven't had the response yet, but I mean, do you think we're going to have to get the same sort of argument said, that these are leaks in the end and those leaks have to be shut down?
Yeah, they have to be shut down because they're leaks. Please tell me why the story that was written by Mr. Kim, has leaked to Mr. Rosen and written by him, damages national security. I don't think it tells us anything that we didn't know before. And with respect to Holder saying it's the worst thing I've seen in 3 years, you know, I've written this book called Fighting, I'm trying to think of the name of it, Fighting for the Press, the Inside Story of the Pentagon Papers. That's just what they said about the Pentagon Papers. The claims for national security were not dissimilar to the ones that are now being made by Mr. Holder. And guess what? When you look back in history, they all turn out to be a bunch of hooey. I'm not saying that exposing a mole is a bunch of hooey, but I really wanted to have it proved to me that this, in fact, damaged national security. Not that it will damage national security, because that's just somebody's idea of probable events. I'm very, I have a jaundiced eye about what Mr. Holder says.
But up to this point, many independent journalists have been persecuted, frankly, by the administration. Just today, the ACLU filed suit against the FBI for the monitoring of a website called antiwar.com, which is a libertarian website. And yet, and you mentioned Julian Assange clearly, the New York Times and other mainstream journalists that haven't been too bothered about all of this. In fact, the New York Times has been pretty critical of Julian Assange, even though they use WikiLeaks pretty routinely. Do you think that we're at some sort of turning point now? Well,
I wrote this book in part as a clarion call to the press to wake up. I wrote it, came out 2 weeks ago. Wake up. Obama is dangerous because his theories of the First Amendment, which are the same theories he used in the Rosen case, are very bad. And forget about the fact you don't like Julian Assange. I've never met a journalist who liked Julian Assange. And wake up to the fact that he is publishing on a website the same as you are, or your employer is, or you are personally. Hey, we're all protected by the First Amendment, so get behind Julian Assange. Now, these two events, I think, is going to start turning into support for Assange, and of course my book will be highly persuasive. So I have more optimism now than I did a couple of weeks ago.
James Goodale, thank you very much. Julian Sanchez, thank you very much too. Now to Chile, where mass protests by thousands of students and union members overshadowed President Sebastián Piñera's final State of the Nation speech. The students are demanding the end of the privatized education system in favor of free higher education. I'm joined by the Chilean political analyst, Patricio Zamorano, who's an adjunct professor at George Washington University. Professor, then what exactly are the students' demands?
Well, what they want is basically free education for all, which is used to be the situation in Chile until the beginning of the dictatorship in 1973. Education, especially universities, it used to be public and used to be free. Pinochet actually privatized a lot of, or a big chunk of the education system in Chile. So now we are suffering the consequences of that. And at the same time, he sent the education from the central government to municipalities in every single city of Chile, which meant poor cities offer a very poor education, rich cities are able to offer a very good, high-quality public education. So the students are saying now we want public and free education for all.
But I mean, how affordable is the education system as things stand?
It's very expensive now. For example, if you go to a public school or a public university, I mean, you can pay in terms of tuition from $5,000 to $8,000 a year. If you compare that, 60%, more than 60% of the workers in Chile make $6,000 a year. That means for a lot of families in Chile, you have to choose between food and education, and that's the biggest problem in Chile.
Has the problem been there that Piñera has made some changes, but they're they're within the system, so giving more grants perhaps, or lowering the interest rates on loans. He's just simply not interested in changing the entire system, which is what the students want.
Exactly, and that's just a minor thing. What we need is a change of the structure of the way that the education is actually funded. More than that, I guess, or I believe that we don't have a problem in terms of access. In fact, 99% of students are able to go to elementary school, 90% goes to high school. But the problem we have is in terms of quality. The middle class in Chile and poor families want a better education for all. And what we have now is this, 64% or 65% of the students actually go to public schools. That means 40% of students in universities, versus 7% of students go to private schools, only 7%, which represent 25% on universities. So basically we are there is an over-representation of students who are coming from the private system, who are rich, maybe wealthy, or wealthier than the middle class. And at the same time, we are subsidizing the rich through the public universities of Chile. And that's a big problem.
So these demonstrations time to coincide with Piñera's final State of the Nation address. And things aren't looking good for Piñera right now. I mean, his approval rating is, what, 34%? Disapproval rate of 56%.
Exactly, yeah.
What has gone so wrong? Is it just the education issue, or are there other issues?
In fact, it's not just the education issue. Piñera, as a government, is extremely weak in terms of education. Even the approval rate for that area is just 25%. So Piñera is extremely weak now. He's not a popular president. He's facing his last year in power, and he's desperate, I guess, trying to fix or to find a solution for the education crisis. We have to remember that he has had 4 ministers of education during his government. So that shows you how critical the education is for his government.
But it's not just him. I mean, the right-wing coalition then are also in trouble. You know, the candidate, the presidential candidate we thought was going to be representing them, has dropped out of the race. I mean, what has been the problem?
Big problem, because the government, actually the coalition of parties, don't like to each other. They have very big divisions. The whole coalition of government, not all of them are parties that actually like or support the legacy of Pinochet. For example, his own party is a little far down from the Pinochet's legacy, and he has to share power with the other political party, the UDI, which is very conservative, and they are the ones who are trying to protect Pinochet's legacy. So you have basically a coalition within the government who don't share the core of principles of his government.
The former president, Michelle Bachelet, then, looks like she's set to win in November, although it's a long time till November.
You never know.
Can she deliver on education? She didn't deliver on education before. At least she didn't meet the students' demands before.
She couldn't, and actually she doesn't agree 100% of what the students are asking for. The students want free education for all. What she's saying is, hey, we need to make sure that people coming from wealthy families, students, young students, if they are able to afford, they should pay something. But the students are fighting for a principle, the principle of free education for all. And but Bachelet so far is enjoying a very good approval rate, more than 50%. So I would say that she's in better shape than the government candidates. But still, we have several months before the election, so in politics, you never know.
But how do you think history is going to judge Piñera's presidency?
It's not going to be very generous. I guess he has handled the education crisis in the worst way possible, with not a lot of dialogue, with a lot of violence on the streets. We have to remember that the police has exercised a lot of repression against the students. Now we have the new ambassador of Chile in the U.S. Is a former minister of education, also Felipe Bulnes, and he's responsible also politically for the repression that the students suffered during 2011. It was was extremely bad. The police used dogs. There were like accusations of sexual assaults against the students. So it's very bad. And I guess Piñera is just trying to recover at least the last year of his government to be in better shape for the candidate who is going to represent the right-wing parties now, right?
Professor Patricio Zamorano, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.